We all know that Half-Life 1 was a fantastic game. It completely changed the way the world thought about first-person shooters, and paved the way for incredible games like Deus Ex, BioShock, and both Prey games, by bringing a little bit of immersive sim feel to a wholly action-oriented, fast-paced shooter. By doing this, it brought the idea of narrative-driven games to the common, just-in-it-for-fun gamer, who otherwise was happy with games like Quake and Duke Nukem and their sparse storytelling. It made the mainstream realize that games could be both artistically driven and fast-paced fun. But today I'd like to talk about the often overlooked details that make the Half-Life series, and particularly its seminal game, so great and worth coming back to after almost 20 years. Firstly, let's look at the game's main threat, other humans, starting with the HECU soldiers. To my knowledge, Half-Life invented the modern bark that's seen in just about every combat-based game since. A bark is basically a sound bit that tells the player what the AI is thinking. Whose footsteps are those? Must have been nothing. Grenade! Hold your position! Without barks like these, games would be much harder, and the nuances of complicated AI would be lost on most players. Just picture Metal Gear Solid or Fear if the enemy's soldiers didn't say a word. In Half-Life, the soldiers' barks, as well as the automated announcement system, are all controlled by a live system that has hundreds of pre-recorded words strung together into predetermined sentences. That's why the soldiers sound a little bit janky sometimes. They didn't record somebody saying fire in the hole, it sounds more like fire in the hole. Marfitimus Blackimus has a great video on this system. While I think this unintentionally adds to the surreal, almost horror feel of Half-Life 1, there's no denying its ability to convey what the soldiers are thinking and how they're communicating. That, combined with their incredibly fast and aggressive nature, makes the Half-Life soldiers feel like some of the smartest AIs in gaming since, and they're certainly hard to fight. They take turns slowly pushing up towards the player, cover to cover, meaning that there's usually someone providing covering fire as the others advance. Something a lot of players might not have realized in the heat of the battle is that the soldiers are unable to attack while moving. This gives the player time, if only a split second, to watch how the enemies advance, retreat, and act. Half-Life 2 desperately could have used this downtime, as its combined squads really are very clever deep down, but seem more like bowling pins to the player in practice. Half-Life 2 is a total power trip, but I'll get into that later. Long story short, the aggressive nature of the HECU soldier makes fighting them a real challenge, and an exercise in tactical combat that's hardly been matched since. While we're on the topic of humans, let's look at the HECU soldier's polar opposite, the Black Ops assassins Gordon encounters just before he's ambushed and sent into the trash compactor. These enemies are absolutely devious. They're fast, they can jump up way above the player's head to sneak up on them and run away, and as Ross Scott puts it in The Excellent Freeman's Mind, to beat a ninja, you have to think like a ninja. These enemies don't have any barks, there's no telling what's going through their mind, but the nuances of their AI are such an integral part of fighting them that they still aren't lost on the player. They quickly sneak around, shooting you when your back is turned, and instantly throwing a grenade and running away as soon as the player turns to face them. You have to be ready and anticipate where they're going to be next if you want to have a chance. Explosives help too. Like the HECU soldiers, they only attack when they're standing still, so if you can catch one off guard, you'll want to track them for as long as you can as they jump around and above to break your line of sight in their escape. On hard mode, they even turn invisible, which, combined with their black suits, deadly accurate shots, and the dark areas they generally fight in, makes for a fight that's tricky to say the least. They're totally different from the HECU soldiers, and their few appearances serve as a great punctuation mark between sections of the game. With the human enemies thoroughly discussed, let's look at the other major part of the game's AI, the aliens. They seem to be a little bit simpler than the soldiers, in part due to the lack of barks, but the diversity in the large roster of aliens completely makes up for this. Where better to start than the game's first enemy, the headcrab. Headcrabs are easy enough to kill, on hard it takes only 3 shots from your fairly accurate Glock, but if you're frugal like me, you probably prefer to take them out with the crowbar most of the time. They serve as a great bit of matador fighting when taken on like this. Firstly, you dance around, getting slightly closer to them with each step, but being sure not to stand still, as their lunge is fast and painful. But once they've lunged and missed, they're vulnerable, having to do a very slow turnaround to face the player, giving you time to get in a few whacks with the crowbar, killing them. However, they often show up in groups of 3 or more, making this a bit of a bomb defusal process ever more complicated. Simple and fun. The hound eyes aren't too much of a threat when they're alone, or when the player has plenty of space to get away from them in, but when in a group, not only is their attack stronger, but they can spread the damage out farther. Generally, you want to take them on one at a time, making sure you've memorized the path you came in on so you can quickly backpedal as you fire. The Vortigaunts can be tricky, especially on hard where their charge time is reduced by almost a full second, but making effective use of cover and keeping them in a short to medium range to confuse their group into rushing for melee attacks can see you through most of their encounters without too much headache. The zombies are simple enough, requiring a bit of the famous wrench dance, or just making sure you don't get surrounded to beat them. Bull squids are a bit more dangerous, but dodging can help you surpass so long as you don't get stuck on anything for too long. And the alien grunts, while dangerous, are dumb, and can easily be outsmarted with explosives. The flying guys are just a bastard to fight. I recommend tight spaces where you can bottleneck them to take them on one at a time, although most of the Zen areas they appear in make this either tricky or inefficient. So that covers the common enemies, but what about the uncommon ones, like the tentacles? I'd like to think they have a more interesting name, but I can't find it. Every time I see these guys, I get a little bit of a fuzzy spot in my heart. Sure, you can use explosives to distract them and get past, but you can also tame them to a degree. If you play your cards right and make sure not to make any noise, they're completely harmless. They'll go from all three slamming around the vicinity of the last noise you made, to a couple of them giving up their search, with one vacantly scanning the area in a circle, to all three just sitting there not doing anything but waiting for the next noise to attack. I just love watching these guys at work, and I usually find myself sitting in their chamber watching them calm down before I progress. They're almost cute when viewed through this lens. Lastly, the cockroaches. Not even enemies, but advanced nonetheless. They love dark areas and will pile up on any chunks of meat that happen to be lying around, but if you start shining your flashlight at them, or just being there, the giant man you are, they'll quickly retreat to underneath appliances or pipes. Marfitimus Blackamus on YouTube has dozens of amazing videos dissecting the various AI in this game, and they're all worth watching. But now, let's step away from the AI and look at a few other details that make this game so timeless. We all know that Half-Life's loading screens were a great innovation. Instead of the screen fading to black or time transition, the game simply freezes for a second, and you're right back where you were before the loading. There aren't any cuts over the course of Gordon's entire adventure. I think a huge part of what makes the Half-Life series one of the most immersive of all time is the simple fact that from the moment you start out on that tram to the end of the Half-Life 2 trilogy's events, we see everything Gordon saw, and never lose control of him throughout. As far as Gordon is concerned, the 20-year gap between Half-Life 1 and 2 felt like a split second. Gordon truly is 100% the perfect blank slate for the player. He can have whatever personality the player wants, and he will absolutely never make a decision without the player making it. Because of this, you can be completely concerned with saving as many people as possible, or you can kill them all. You can be against the Combine, or just want to get some breakfast and stop fighting everyone, like Ross Scott in Freeman's Mind 2. Gordon's forced to help the rebellion, and to stop the Nihilith, just because it's either that, or die. How he actually feels about his situation is entirely linked to how the player feels about his situation. Your thoughts are Gordon's, and Gordon is you. It's a pretty simple thing, really, but I've never heard anyone mention the fact that there isn't a single time transition in the Half-Life series that Gordon wouldn't have perceived himself. I think the last thing that makes Half-Life 1 so unforgettable, and so much fun to revisit over and over and over, is the survival horror tone the gameplay sets up. Both Half-Life games were originally intended to be much darker, but while Half-Life 2 is a total power trip, with attracted people fighting their alien masters through the second coming of Gordon Christ, in Half-Life 1, Gordon is just trying to survive against all odds, and aside from the generally unforgiving gameplay, some really dark stuff happens over the course of the game. Gordon causes tons of accidental deaths of his colleagues, and while this is still the case in Half-Life 2, they seem to forgive him for it. Soldiers who have no idea what's going on are executing scientists by the hundreds. They lose control of the situation, and eventually Black Ops soldiers are sent in to cover up the cover-up, and when that goes wrong, they just nuke the entire place. Gordon is basically forced to travel to Zen to kill the Nihilith, which it's lightly implied is the last of its species and is only trying to help the various aliens of the game escape the Combine's rule, and above all else, all the terrible things that happen over the course of the games are all, to some extent, Gordon's fault. He's the one who pushed the crystal into the beam and started it all. Some of the guards even say, "I'd like to get my hands on the guy responsible for this mess." Those facts, combined with the unforgiving resource management gameplay, makes Half-Life a total survival horror game in my book. There are a ton of obvious things that make Half-Life a classic, but I think it's underappreciated just how perfect almost everything, from the big picture to the tiny details and human touches is, making Half-Life truly unforgettable, even after all this time.